Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's ECA Coronavirus Impact webinar. Today's topic is the future of furlough. We'll be discussing the most recent changes to the government's furlough scheme, the more detailed implications of fuller government guidance, and much more. Our panelists today are Andrew Eldred and Sneha Doshi. Andrew is ECA's Director of Employment and Skills, and Sneha is ECA's Senior Employee Relations Advisor. Now, before I hand over to our panelists, just a reminder that you can ask a question at any time using the Q&A box on your screen. Our panelists will be answering as many of your questions as possible at the end of the session. And finally, viewers are reminded that a full replay of today's session, as well as replays of the entire ECA webinar series, are available on ECA's YouTube channel. That's at youtube.com/ECA Live. For more information and guidance and more materials related to business recovery, visit www.eca.co.uk/business-recovery. We hope you enjoy the session. Over to you, Andrew.
Yes, thanks, Omar, and welcome everybody on a rainy June morning. Title is Future of Furlough. You'll see from the slide there, we're covering a little bit more than that. I'll kick off with, as Omar says, the latest on furlough, majoring on particular on the new feature, the newest feature, which is flexible furlough. Then Sneha will pick up with regard to alternative options, and we'll have the Q&A at the end. Those of you who are eagle-eyed will notice that the Rishi Sunak photograph is an old one. You'll notice that from the slogan, the stay home slogan. It made me reflect. 20th of March is actually less than 3 months ago. And what we're really looking at now, we hope, is the final iteration. There have been 14 updates and amendments to the furlough scheme and the furlough guidance since that date. Hopefully this will take us to the end of October. As Omar said, the both of us are presenting. For those of you who don't know, as Employment and Skills Director, I've got a lot of focus on things like the JIB and apprenticeships, particularly through JTL. We're not going to talk about the JIB specifically as part of the presentation, anticipating you might be asking questions about that at the end, but it will be at the end. We're not going to address those issues specifically. We're going to talk about the general guidance and the general law. And just a reminder that in addition to these webinars, there's quite a lot of resources that you can tap into. There's the recovery webpage, which hopefully many of you are already familiar with. That's pretty much now replaced the original coronavirus webpage that we had. A lot of guidance, a lot of links to government and industry material as well, and all the documents that we're going to talk about today. Our guidance document, also entitled Future of Furlough, and the various guidance documents that Sneha is going to talk about during the course of her slot in the presentation. They're all there. Obviously, as always, for ECA members, there's the helpline if you want expert tailored advice. And just a reminder, particularly as Sneha, we'll be talking about issues such as redundancy and other challenges that we're likely to face. A reminder that the ECA at a regional level has always run a labour loan scheme. So potential opportunity if you're facing the prospect of losing labour or actually looking for labour for firms to loan it out to each other. So both sides of the equation effectively have the likelihood of winning. That's something which really you need to talk to your regional manager about, or one of their team regionally. We are hoping to come up with some enhancements to the labour loan scheme in the next few weeks, so watch the space on that. But in the meantime, as always, it's operating at a regional basis. Okay, just before we sort of launch into flexible furlough, just a few facts and figures. I'm going to let the stats there talk for themselves, just comment on a couple of things. Number one, interesting, looking at a whole construction point of view, you've actually got more people self-employed in construction benefiting from the self-employed income support scheme than actually under the furlough scheme. Now, looking forward, of course, you're probably aware the government is looking at the whole future of tax and national insurance treatment for the self-employed. The People Survey, about 40 ECA members participated in a general survey a couple of weeks ago, organised by the Construction Leadership Council. The figures there are all construction figures, but as you can see, still at that time, fairly significant numbers of people on furlough, and presaging what one of the things that Sneha is going to talk about, and redundancies in the offing for many of you. We're looking separately at those 40 ECA responses and analysing those, and we'll be sort of publicising those because we think there are likely to be some significant differences. And finally, another stat, and a fairly important and sobering stat, JTL, which is the largest apprenticeship training provider for our part of the industry. As you can see, this is a bit of a snapshot. A few weeks ago, a couple of weeks ago, it was 3,500. I think it's down to 3,000 now, so things are improving. But that's still 3,000 JTL apprentices on furlough, and the majority of those electrical apprentices. And there's no reason to believe that that's not replicated amongst other providers. I'm picking up on the question of apprentices at the end of what I've got to say today. So, flexible furlough. ECA and others, I mean, we've been calling for greater flexibility in the furlough scheme for some time. I think employers have found it a little frustrating, this sort of binary, black and white, you're either on work or you're on furlough, and that's the 3-week minimum period for furlough. So I mean, back on the 12th of May, when Rishi Sunak first announced that he was going to make it more flexible, he was talking about part-time furlough. That's now called flexible furlough, and you'll see in a sec quite how flexible it is. So we got the confirmation that it was going to be called flexible furlough and some of the details on the 29th of May. We've now got the full details. They were published last Friday on the 12th of May, 12th of June, and that's what we're basing today's presentation on. What is flexible furlough about? Well, these are the topics that I'm going to try and deal with, and it is really related to facilitating the return to work. As the government says, we're open for business again, and flexible furlough is intended to make that easier, and is available, as you can see, from the 1st of July. So what is it? Well, I mean, read the guidance yourself, but I think effectively it's what you want it to be. The main concept, that's not a difficult concept to get your head around, is time. And it's really for anybody who spends part of their time working and part of their time, which will be then their usual working time, furloughed. So there's a concept which is quite an important one of usual hours. So each of us have usual hours. As you go into the detail of the guidance, what constitutes usual hours can vary depending on the type of employment people have. There's one group of people who are regarded as having fixed hours. That's more notionally fixed hours. It's really people whose pay doesn't vary depending on how much they work. So that would be often salaried people. And then there's the concept of people who are on variable hours. That's really people whose pay varies depending upon the number of hours they work. So that's likely to include most sort of hourly paid operatives in our industry, particularly if they're working regular overtime. So depending on the type of person, you then get an idea of what the usual hours are, and basically under the flexible furlough scheme, the decision you have to make and you have to define is the split. So you define a certain number of working hours, and for working hours, it's the employer who pays for everything. And then for the furloughed hours, it's the existing situation, essentially. There is a grant available, and you'll be familiar with the percentages and the figures associated with that, although those will be changing over time. I'll come to that later. An important point to make at this stage, though, is that it's not a straitjacket. There is not an expectation that you must define now and forever that it's X number of hours worked and Y number of hours furlough. And in the guidance, it's very clear that the government accepts that actual hours may differ from those sort of notionally defined at the beginning of the furlough, the flexible furlough period. So there is an acceptance that there can be some fluctuation depending upon work availability and other sort of unanticipated changes. And the other aspect, and this is a direct quote from the government guidance, flexible furlough can accommodate any amount of time and any shift pattern. So, I mean, and that's the importance of moving away from the term which Rishi Sunak originally used on the 12th of May, which was part-time furlough. Yeah, it can include part-time working as we generally understand it. So it can include somebody who's working 3 days a week, on for 3 days, off for 2, somebody coming in just in the mornings or just in the afternoons, all those kind of things. I mean, that's the sort of thing which I imagine more likely to work within the context of office-based staff. Other arrangements more likely to relate to those working on sites, particularly hourly paid people, would be more around reduced hours arrangements. So one possibility is people work less overtime or no overtime. Comparison with what they usually do. An example of that would be the double day shift, which I think some sites are looking at now because of issues of social distancing and the desire to maintain levels of production. So the double day is seen as a way of squaring that particular circle. So it could be around reducing the overtime. Of course, overtime in many cases is not contractual. There's no contractual entitlement to the overtime. Therefore, that would not be something that normally would require you to amend the contract of employment, although you would need to take some advice on that if there is some doubt about that in your own contract. More drastic, of course, is you cut the basic hours. So you're paying, you're working less than the normal basic hours, which in a JIB context is 37.5 hours a week. That almost certainly is going to require a change of the contract. And taking it to its logical conclusion, you could conceivably have something akin to a 0 hours or minimum hours arrangement. It might not be desirable, but it is certainly possible under the flexible furlough scheme as it's described in the guidance. And that really relates to something which I think would be of interest to those firms who do a lot of emergency cover and call out and so on. There's nothing to stop you from using this arrangement for some sort of call out arrangement. That's not to say there aren't challenges. The idea of somebody being on call whilst they're on furlough, you've got to be careful about the notice you give people, but those are really HR issues, personnel issues, rather than compliance issues. As far as the scheme itself is concerned, as far as the rules and the guidance are concerned, that kind of arrangement is perfectly possible. And another important thing is that flexible furlough really is now the best route, we would suggest, for dealing with the issue of rotating people between work and furlough. If all you're really looking for at the moment is people to be either working or on furlough and not mixing and matching, but dealing with the sort of the issues by alternating people between the two, then flexible furlough does allow you to do that. You're not committed to 3 weeks off anymore. It can be any rotation pattern that you want. So in terms of implementation, and a lot on this slide is going to be familiar to you from full-time furlough. Just like full-time furlough, there's a real emphasis on the need for a discussion between the employer and the worker and an agreement to move to a flexible furlough. And certainly an agreement if that involves any changes to the employment contract, such as, for example, as I've described, reducing in the size of the guaranteed working week. Collective consultation, probably less of an issue. It's only going to apply if you're making changes or proposing changes affecting 20 or more employees. It's only going to apply if your process for affecting that change is dismissing people and re-engaging them. And then you get into the whole business of 30-day consultation, 45-day consultation, depending upon the numbers involved. because of the numbers involved and because of the unlikelihood, I think, of you wanting to go down that route, or indeed your workforce wanting to go down that route, I think it's unlikely ever to apply. And if you do face that kind of possibility, then I would strongly suggest as ECA members you get in contact with the ECA helpline. Again, as with full-time furlough, the agreement has to be in writing, has to be kept on record for 5 years in case Revenue and Customs want to come and look at it. And a couple of important additional points. We're pretty sure that if you've got somebody currently on full-time furlough and want to move them to flexible furlough, then you really do need to put in place a new agreement, obviously dealing with the specific issues around the flexible furlough. It's unlikely that you can rely on the full-time furlough letter. And obviously that's true if you're moving somebody from currently working to flexible furlough. Additional procedural requirements for company directors. Again, you'll be familiar, particularly if you're company directors yourselves, you'll be familiar with the additional procedural requirements that have been put in place for company directors. The need for any recommendation to furlough a company director to be formally reported to the company, to be the question should be there should be a formal decision, a formal record, and a formal written communication to the director from the company. I believe, and there's no clarity or anything explicit in the guidance. I would suggest that if you are in a situation, as with the employees and the agreements, if you are in a situation where a company director currently fully furloughed, I would suggest that any flexible furlough arrangement, any move to a flexible furlough arrangement, also needs to go through that company process, if only to protect you, because of course what freeing your time up means is that for the working hours you are freed from some of those restrictions previously in place around making money for the company, doing business for the company, which strictly speaking, if you're fully furloughed, you haven't been able to do. In terms of who pays, well, I've already said for worked hours, as you would expect, the employer pays, and the employer pays everything, and there is no subsidy, there is no grant. So effectively, what you pay for worked hours is down to what's in the employment contract, or subject, of course, to any amendment to the employment contract. So if there's any reduction of pay, any removal of premium time or whatever, any reduction in benefits and so on, that's got to be something that has to be agreed and changed, so that you are still complying with the agreement with the employee if you're paying less during those worked hours. On furloughed hours, again, the system is the same, is that the grant is available. The difference, and I'm sure you can understand the logic here, the difference is the size of that grant is reduced proportionately with basically the relationship between the furloughed hours and the usual hours. So whatever the proportion of the usual hours is the furloughed hours, that's the proportion of the grant that you are entitled to claim to up to the maximum. So, for example, somebody who is furloughed for 2 days a week, effectively the available grant is reduced down to 40% of what it would be otherwise. Bit of a calculation that I've done in relation to the JIB. Obviously the JIB is 37.5 hours basic working week. Quite a lot of people actually work 45 hours there or thereabouts, so that's a difference of 7.5 hours. So you could arguably, if you reduce people down to their basic hours, maybe in relation to a double day shift, that's effectively leaving 7.5 hours as potentially furloughed hours, which amounts to 16.67%. Not a huge amount of money. I think it amounts to between 90 and 100 quid a week, but nevertheless, it's potentially there. There is complexity here. There is complexity here, and you really do need to read the guidance, and our own ECA flexible furlough guide aims to help you navigate your way through that. But I think one thing probably to say is the online calculator, the HMRC online calculator, it's had a fair bit of criticism, but I think now is the time when it probably comes into its own, because the situation you're likely to be in is you need to work out what you should be paying people, maybe before you're entirely sure what you're going to get back from the revenue. So running some of the calculations through that calculator will help you get greater certainty that what you're paying is what ultimately you'll be able to claim back. Now, an important point, and I'll deal with it in more detail in a sec. As you're probably aware, even for the furloughed time, even for the time covered by the grant, increasingly there is an onus on the employer to start contributing to that bit as well. There's a gradual tapering down of the government's contribution from the 1st of August, but I'll come to the detail in that later. So in terms of other issues, so we've dealt with flexible furlough. Going to cover off now, before handing over to Sneha, a few other furlough type issues, things that have been updated, things that are now current. And I will start with that grant issue. How do you calculate the grant, and by extension, therefore, how do you try to work out what you need to pay people for their furloughed time? I mean, the good news is it's essentially the basic calculation is the same. What counts as wages is the same. And in fact, in the new guidance, there's greater clarity over the whole issue of non-discretionary overtime. I know some people have found the government's use of the term non-discretionary a little bit confusing. In accordance with what we've been saying all along, and in accordance with what a lot of people have concluded was the case, I mean, the good news is if people are working regular overtime, that is something that can be included in the grant calculation, and there is now clarity that that's available. And of course, the other aspect of this is that as far as the worker is concerned, whether it's flexible furlough or full-time furlough, they're not affected. The amount of money that they get for the furloughed time is the same. But of course, the difference is the share between the employer and the government is starting to shift. It stays the same in June and July, but then it starts to shift in August. Quite a complicated table here. Again, it's in the guidance, and it probably, you know, you can study that at your leisure. And it's also in the government guidance. But as I said, basically what this table tells you, looking at June and July, it's basically the status quo. The government are covering off the national insurance contributions, the pension contributions, and the wages, 80% of wages up to £2,500 a month, with the employer not contributing anything in respect of those. From August, the first change, for the month of August, the change is that the employer starts to pay the employer NICs and pension. Obviously, if it's flexible furlough, they're already paying the NICs and the pension on the working hours. From August, whether it's flexible furlough or regular furlough, full-time furlough, the employer national insurance contributions and pension contributions for the furlough time are paid by the employer. In September, then the employer is paying 10% of the 80%, and then in October, the employer is paying 20% of the 80%. In terms of the claims process, a lot of it is staying the same. And I mean, the general feedback we've had on the claims process is that people have found it reasonably helpful, reasonable, straightforward, and we haven't really heard many complaints. So a lot of the good features are staying the same. With the changes, though, to furlough, flexible furlough, there are some changes in terms of claims, some of them arguably beneficial, some of them creating some new challenges of their own. The first point to make is you can, if you want, claim weekly from the 1st of July, rather than there being a minimum of 3 weeks. Now that sits alongside, in the case of flexible furlough, or indeed furlough as a whole, the reality that you can operate any kind of pattern or rotation. I suppose the issue for many employers, and certainly for payroll departments, is how you fit your furlough arrangements, your pay arrangements in with your claim period, to try and make things as simple as possible. Another thing that you're going to have to fit around is that your claims can no longer overlap calendar months. So you're going to have to shoehorn whatever claim you have into calendar months from July onwards. And you'll see this in the government guidance. They quite upfront, in quite a lot of detail, the government says to employers, you really need to think about what your claim period is going to be, and bear that in mind, particularly if you're going to get involved in flexible furlough kind of arrangements. Bear that in mind, and how all of those things gel together: the claim period, the furloughing arrangement, and the pay period that you operate for your employees. And of course, you might operate different pay periods for different employees. Another biggie, another big one, which I think is very significant, is that there is now a cap on numbers. So you cannot claim for any claim period after the 1st of July a higher number, a bigger number than the maximum that you've claimed in any previous claim period. So what does that mean in practice? For example, if between March and June, you've made a number of claims, and let's say they fluctuated between 5 and 18. If like your biggest claim was for 18 people, let's say back in April. What that effectively means is from the 1st of July, you are not going to be able to claim for any more than 18. The other point to make is if you're operating flexible furlough, there will need to be some additional information included in your claim. And as you would expect, it makes sense, it's entirely logical. That additional information is really going to be you declaring what are the workers' usual hours, what were their worked hours, what were their furloughed hours. And that's in that context, particularly if you're claiming after the event, the worked hours can be the actual worked hours. One final note to make: that cap on numbers, there are exceptions, but they're relatively small, and they are literally the two that are mentioned there, where you've got people who have not been able to be included in furlough in the past because they've been on statutory family leave, or been on duty as reservists. They can be added on to that cap. So in my example, let's say you had a couple of people in that situation, then you could put in a claim for 18 plus 2 in that situation after the 1st of July. This is another one. Just as there is a cap, there are other people now who are going to be excluded from the scheme who weren't previously excluded. Obviously, we've got people who've always been excluded, and the obvious example there are the people who weren't on your payroll and whom you hadn't reported to the revenue by the 19th of March. But there are now some others, and like those people who weren't reported by the 19th of March, these people can never be furloughed at any time in the future. And the cutoff date is effectively the 10th of June. So the cutoff date has passed. So effectively, if somebody hasn't been, if there are people working for you who haven't been furloughed by the 10th of June, they are now permanently excluded from furlough. A couple of exceptions, which are the exceptions you've already heard of, again, identified at the bottom of this slide. But the basic principle is that if people hadn't been furloughed at all up to the 10th of June, then they're out as far as any future furloughing or flexible furloughing is concerned. Obviously, that's important because it will include probably people who've continued working by definition throughout the lockdown period. But for those people, you're effectively thrown back on, if there are bumps in the road in future, you're effectively thrown back on some of the alternative options that Sneha is going to talk to you about a little bit later. Furlough is not an answer for those people. And of course, what that does mean is for some of those people in situations which previously furlough has provided quite a convenient solution for, if people are only falling into those categories now, then furlough is not going to be the way to sort it. So the examples you can see on the slide, people who only now are falling into the situation where they're required to shield or otherwise are chronically vulnerable, people who only now are telling you that they've got caring responsibilities, people who fall sick and it's a long-term illness. The furlough is not going to provide an answer for those people unless at some point in the past 3 months they have been furloughed for the minimum 3-week period. Everyone else is shut out. And the next bullet point is simply repeating what I've already said, is people who exceed the cap, except for those 2 exclusions. And those exclusions, as you will see, also apply to people who haven't been furloughed at all up to the 10th of June. If people, one of the reasons that they weren't furloughed before the 10th of June was that they were on family leave, statutory family leave, or on reservist duties, they are excluded from that cutoff, and you can put them on furlough in the future. Okay, so I mean that deals with flexible furlough and other changes to the furlough scheme as we know it. Before handing over to Sneha to talk about some of the alternatives to furlough, I just want to highlight this because it is an issue which I know is at the forefront of many of our members' minds, and it's apprentices, and apprentices are a crucial part of the industry. But the reality is that there are many of them still on furlough. We estimate between 40 and 50% at the moment. And why is that? Well, partly it's to do with health and safety concerns, to do with things like shared travel and close supervision on site. It's also a practical question when it comes to getting access to site. With limited numbers on site, the people that tend to get assigned to site are those who are fully qualified, fully flexible, fully productive. And that's not going to include apprentices, certainly not going to include apprentices in their early years. And we also know that employers are in a situation now, understandably, where they're looking at the new recruitment round and thinking, what are we going to do about next year's recruitment? Clearly, as ECA and as employers, we want the industry to carry on employing as many apprentices as possible and employing them throughout the 4 or 5 years it takes to qualify. They are the future. Obviously, in past recessions, companies who've let apprentices go before their time have lived to regret it. It creates a sort of a gap in terms of capability and experience within the company. Also, at the moment, I think a lot of young people are looked on as being the way in which companies can move into new markets, new technology particularly. There is a strong return on investment argument, and there's a link there to the TESP report on that last year, which showed a return on investment over the 4 years of between 30 and 60 grand. There are lots of resources in place to allow apprentices to continue learning and if necessary, have a break in learning. And there's lots of information there in the government guidance. One thing I wanted to highlight to you in particular is that ECA has been working on some health and safety guidance covering off the issues of shared travel and on-site supervision. We'll be publishing those on the recovery webpage no later than next week, and hopefully that will help put your mind at rest. Those risks can be managed, and Paul Reeve, our head of health and safety, he has played a big role in pulling those together. And also I would ask you to watch this space over the next couple of weeks. We are expecting there to be an announcement at an industry level about a talent retention scheme funded by government, and that will work hopefully hand in hand with ECA's own labour loan scheme. And you would have seen also the Prime Minister and others talking about extra support for young people, extra support for apprenticeships. So I would say watch this space on this. I don't think anybody is rushing into making any really serious decisions about apprentices, but clearly people are thinking about it. And I mean, our role at ECA and that of the government and of the wider industry is to try and support you in that. Okay, hopefully that's giving you the lowdown on most of the key issues to do with furlough. I'm going to hand over now to Sneha to talk about the alternatives. And Sneha, I'm still got the control of the presentation, so when you want me to move slides, let me know, yeah?
Okay, will do. Thanks, Andrew. Thank you. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to be looking at the options available to you as employers if for any reason furlough is not available or is not the appropriate route. Next slide, please, Andrew. Thanks. So the furlough provisions have and will continue to provide welcome support to many employers during the current COVID-19 outbreak. However, furlough is not necessarily the right option for all circumstances. We recognise that. Firstly, the government's coronavirus job retention scheme, which supports the furlough financially, excludes employers from claiming funding for certain employees. These are, as Andrew has mentioned, those who started working for their employer after the cut-off date in March 2020, as well as those who had not been furloughed for the first time for at least 3 weeks by 10th of June. Secondly, as Andrew has outlined, the cost to employers of furloughed employees will increase from August and will continue to increase in each successive month until the end of the scheme in October. Now, this brings me to the next point, which is that the Chancellor has announced that the furlough scheme will close at the end of October 2020. Lastly, while more sites continue to open and restrictions on hospitality is expected to ease so that employees can find somewhere to stay when working away from home, the impact on site operating practices due to COVID-19 is likely to mean that most sites will not be able to accommodate the numbers of workers that they had pre-March 2020. Many sites are introducing limits on the number of workers allowed access at any one time, while other health and safety measures often make it impossible to have the same numbers of workers on site as there would have been under pre-lockdown conditions. So as employers, you may therefore need to look at alternatives to furlough. Next slide, please, Andrew. Thanks. Now, the traditional response for many employers facing the possibility of reduced work is to look to redundancies as a means of meeting the downturn. However, if there's anything we've learned from the last few months, it is surely that the traditional way of doing things are not always the most appropriate way to achieve the desired outcome. So with this in mind, we've produced guidance which is available on the ECA recovery page, link on your screens now, and is called Coronavirus Alternatives to Furlough. Next slide, please, Andrew. So, as the title suggests, in the Alternatives to Furlough guidance, we set out a number of options as alternatives to furlough. They include unpaid leave, reduced hours, and temporary layoff, but there are other options there too. The guidance highlights the factors to be taken into consideration when contemplating seeking agreement to each of the options suggested. Now, those of you who've spoken to me in the past about any employment matter will know the mantra, how important it is to confirm in writing any changes agreed. So to help with this, the guidance includes sample letters to use when confirming changes agreed and to be issued to the employees affected. This guidance does also touch on redundancy. However, there is a separate guidance on managing redundancy. Next slide, please, Andrew. Okay, so our guidance on managing redundancy is also available on the ECA recovery page, and it's a step-by-step, it's much more detailed than in the alternatives to furlough guidance. It is a step-by-step guide on what is redundancy in employment law, identifying the posts at risk of redundancy, identifying the selection pool, producing selection criteria. There's a sample selection matrix included in the guidance. Consultation with the affected employees and where required with their representatives, calculating the correct redundancy and notice entitlements for each employee. And of course, feel free to join in if you know the words. It contains sample letters to use throughout the redundancy process. Now, in addition, we have updated the guidance to incorporate notes on accommodations which may need to be made for the current COVID-19 outbreak. So do please have a look at that if you are contemplating redundancies well ahead, because one of the things that we do highlight is the fact that if people are away from their normal place of work, you may need to allow additional time to consult with them throughout the whole redundancy process. The last document I wanted to mention in this part of the webinar is also on redundancy. This guidance focuses on additional obligations on employers contemplating making 20 or more redundancies within a 90-day period. The document is called Collective Redundancy Consultation Guidance. We're an imaginative bunch, if nothing else, and is also available on the ECA recovery page. It sets out the obligations on employers contemplating making 20 or more employees redundant in a 90-day period, including the requirement to notify the government and how to do that, when the requirement to collectively consult arises, who employers should be conducting their collective consultation with, the objectives of that collective consultation, how to conduct the collective consultation, how to arrange election of employee representatives, and of course factors to take into account for collective consultation during the COVID-19 outbreak. Next slide, please, Andrew. So that's more or less all I wanted to cover, but I just wanted to say if we don't get to your question during the webinar or you have questions that you want to discuss offline, please do make a note of the details here and contact us. Thank you very much for listening, and over to you, Omar.
Thank you very much, Sneha, and thank you to Andrew. Some really complex concepts there that I'm sure our viewers will be very appreciative that you've helped to break down and explain in a bit more detail. There are a few questions. First one from Shireen Lawrence. What happens to holiday entitlement for flexible furlough?
That's definitely a question for Sneha, I think.
And it continues to accrue because they are still employed by you. During furlough, they are still an employee, and holiday entitlement accrues. The statutory holiday entitlement, which is 5.6 weeks as a minimum, continues to accrue while they're furloughed. If you have additional contractual holidays over and above the 5.6 weeks, then of course you can reach an agreement with the employees about reducing that entitlement while they're on furlough if they are amenable to that. But in general, it accrues and they are entitled to take it. And indeed, if you want them to take it whilst the furlough scheme is still in place, and therefore effectively have up to 80% of their holiday pay paid for under the scheme, you can do that. come and talk to us. I don't want to go into too much detail, but you need to give them notice beforehand of at least twice as the amount of days holidays that you want them to take. So for example, if you want them to take a week's holidays, you have to give them 2 weeks notice of that. But again, be sensitive about how you do that and come and talk to us rather than just sort of be authoritarian about it, which I'm sure none of our members would be anyway.
Thank you, Sneha. We have a question now from Diane Arnold, one that I'm sure many employers will relate to at the moment. Diane says, I have a staff member who has been working from home since the start of the lockdown. She's now refusing to come back to work due to childcare and is insisting she can carry out her work from home. We are extremely short-staffed in the office now, with the business now back to full capacity. Can you advise the best way forward?
I think that's another
Sorry,
one for
Omar, I
Sneha.
didn't get the bit about whether they can work from home or whether they're not being able to work from home.
So Dan has a staff member who's been working from home since the beginning of the lockdown, who is now refusing to come back into work due to childcare commitments, but is insisting she can carry out her work from home, even though Dan's office is clearly back to full capacity. So I suppose that the question is, what's the best way to handle those cases where employees don't want to come back in?
Can I take this, Andrew, or you?
Oh, yes, please, Sneha.
Okay, so I think this is, again, this is not so much the furlough issue, but yes, there are going to be issues. And as an employer, you're going to have to do a balancing act. If you want to keep somebody furloughed in those, if you want to put somebody on furlough, if that person has already been furloughed before 10th of June, you can do that. But this person, if I'm getting the details right, is actually working from home. And wants to continue working from home. And I think that is an issue that is going to crop up again and again. And I think as employers, we're all going to have to look at what the reasons are for not wanting people to work from home a little bit more closely, because this whole lockdown thing has proved to many people that a lot of things that we thought couldn't be done from home can actually be done quite effectively from home. So if she is working from home and if she has got childcare issues, our advice would be to let her continue to do that as long as the work is of the standard that you require and at the quality. If, on the other hand, childcare issues mean that you're not getting the standard of work or she's not available during the hours you need her to be available, then come to us and we can help and advise you on, possibly putting her on dependence leave, which would be unpaid, and saying to her, look, you either come into the office because we need this work and that's been put on hold for 3 months, but we now need it to be done and it can only be done in the office, so we need you here. And that would be unpaid. And if she says no, she needs time off to look after her child, and because of the COVID-19 situation, she can't leave them with grandparents, etc., or other childcare provisions, then you may need to allow her to take dependence leave, but that would be unpaid.
Yeah,
I
I mean,
hope that helps.
just to chip in on that. I mean, that broad situation, that broad scenario, somebody refusing to come back, and you want them to come back, that's quite common. But as Sneha has outlined, the answer will vary depending upon the circumstances, and you need to have a dialogue with the employee. Maybe you know about some of their circumstances as well. So yeah, if the granny is down the road, then that's something which puts you in a slightly different complexion on things than if somebody literally, like Dominic Cummings seemingly, has nobody nearby who can provide support. So it's very much the facts and the circumstances, which is why ringing Sneha or Orazio on the helpline, talking some of these things through, including the detail, is something we would recommend if you yourself feel stuck.
Okay, thank you. And just to add before we move on, all the contact details for the employee relations team will be in the video description for the replay of this video. Another question in from Shireen Lawrence. Do the guidelines still exclude shared vehicles?
Yeah, we're talking about slightly different things now. In terms of guidelines, and in this case, we're talking about the working safely guidelines, which was part of the sort of health and safety guidance that was issued back in May, off the back of the government saying they wanted to return to work. The answer is that it is possible to share vehicles if the right safeguards are in place. I mean, luckily, if you go to the ECA recovery webpage, you will see under the health and safety section quite a lot of guidance on travel to work issues, with all sorts of descriptions of alternative options where shared travel is an issue. And clearly it is an issue often for younger apprentices. With regard to apprentices, at the moment, you can look at that general guidance with regard to travel. But as I said, next week, there should be some more tailored guidance on travel, but the same principles apply. And there are options for employers now with regard to shared travel.
Thanks, Andrew. I understand that was more of a health and safety related question.
We've become experts in all sorts of things, Omar. So
exactly, yeah. Over the last few months, we've all become one. Yeah, just a reminder that more guidance on those areas is available, as Andrew said, on our business recovery website, eca.co.uk/business-recovery. We've got time for 3 or 4 more questions. We have one from Guy Jones. Guy says, have the JIB agreed to support the extended and flexible furlough scheme to the end of October?
Yeah. Okay, Guy. Yeah, this is your perennial question. I seem to remember you asking it a couple of months ago when we had the deadline of the end of June. As things stand, the ECA and Unite have reached an agreement with regards to the application of furlough until the end of July. Our view is that also applies to flexible furlough, because from an employee point of view, of course, there isn't a difference in terms of the minimum guarantee that they're getting. I'm hoping very soon that we'll get confirmation of that date being further extended. We've asked for that. We've got Unite still to come back to us on that. But I've got a meeting tomorrow and I'll be pushing for it. I've got no reason to believe that they won't be amenable, but I don't want to mislead you by saying it's a slam dunk, because I haven't yet heard back. But as soon as something is agreed, then that will be issued by the JIB.
Thanks, Andrew. We have a question from Paul Hurt. How do we deal with contracting staff who, whilst work is now available, are reluctant? Right. Okay. So this is similar to the previous question we had from Diane.
Well, I mean, if we talk about people on site, again, it's a similar situation, but different circumstances in terms of the detail. Therefore, different considerations would apply. And clearly, one consideration is, can you do your work from home? And potentially, if people are site-based, by definition, they cannot. I mean, I'll ask Sneha to chip in, but I think what we would say, and it's in the guidance anyway, is you need to have a discussion with the individuals, find out what the concerns are, and do all you can to assuage those concerns. But the context of somebody who's site-based rather than home-based, than office-based, is potentially different. I don't know if you want to say anything more on that, Sneha.
Yeah, I think it's important, if you do ask the question, if you have that conversation with the employee, that you ask what would make it, because a lot of them have saying, a lot of people are saying that they're concerned about their health and safety on site, and just leaving the house basically. And it's put the ball back into their court and say, well, okay, well, what would it take to, allay these fears? What's it going to take? And if they say, well, I'm going to, until the whole vaccine is available and I can be treated, I'm not going to put my vulnerable granny, mother, aunt, uncle, whatever it might be, at risk. So I'm not going to leave the house, or I'm not going to go to work. Then you have a much bigger problem. And I think you then can look at that and say to them, well, we can't reasonably keep you on paid leave or any sort of payment indefinitely. So, you may then have a case to sort of look at terminating the employment. But, that is not a decision to be taken lightly, because these are genuine fears that an employee may have. So you do need to take them into account, and do contact us if it becomes sort of, and everybody's dug their heels in. Before they dig their heels in, come and talk to us on the helpline to see how we can guide that conversation. And there are obviously the employee relations implications of, well, if you let one person stay at home, what's it going to do to the morale and well-being and the incentive of other employees who are being required to come into work? And I think that was an issue we all faced during furlough, when some people were working to get their 100% of the pay and other people were furloughed and receiving 80% of their pay. So it's a similar issue, and it's going to be with us for a while, I think.
Thank you. We've got time for one last question from John Hickey. John says, I believe Andrew made reference to the implications of moving from full-time working to flexible furlough. I thought anyone not furloughed by 10th of June could then move to flexible working. John's asking for a bit of clarity there.
Yeah. The scenario I was thinking about, John, was the scenario where somebody in the past has been furloughed for a minimum of 3 weeks, but has since come back to work. So people in that situation, they might not have been furloughed as of the 10th of June, but they do meet that minimum threshold of 3 weeks. It might have been in March, it might have been in April, it might have been in May, it might have been earlier in June. But as long as they've got the 3 weeks under their belt, they can still be effectively re-furloughed, either on a full-time or a flexible basis from the 1st of July. People in that situation aren't barred. The only people who are barred are the people who've never been furloughed, or have never been furloughed and served the full 3 weeks. Obviously, in some situations, we've had people who've started down furlough and then the furlough has been broken. Unfortunately, unless those people have subsequently completed a full 3 week period of furlough, then they're excluded as well. But it is, as you know, people switch between furlough and work all the time. And somebody who's at work now might not have been at work for the whole of the period since March. Hope that makes it clearer.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. We are reaching time. Any outstanding questions, I'll be sure to forward those on to the relevant team member, and we'll aim to get answers to you as soon as we can. Apologies to those who weren't able to get around to today. And finally, thank you once again, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you very much to our presenters, Andrew and Sneha. Once again, viewers are reminded that a full replay of today's session will be available on our YouTube channel, with links to all the resources and materials discussed below the video. That's youtube.com/ECA Live. And the business recovery materials we referenced today are available on eca.co.uk/business-recovery. And thank you, everyone, and hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Omar. Thanks, everybody.